Live from Berlin, Connecticut. Good afternoon and welcome to today's program and webinar, part of the highly acclaimed series of webinars that ACP, the Association of Contingency Planners, presents for both current and future members. For more information about ACP, please visit www.acp-international.com. My name is Ed Goldberg, and in addition to my role with the Connecticut Chapter, I serve as Corporate ACP's Education Committee Chair. My thanks to Gianna and ACP's headquarters staff at ADG in Albany, and my good friend Fred Rogers at Continuity Housing for their roles as webinar experts who work behind the scenes to ensure that these webinars happen flawlessly. And a big thanks to our webinar series sponsor, Continuity Housing. Continuity Housing guarantees pre-negotiated hotel rooms at substantial savings for the critical employees of larger and mid-sized companies in order to help prevent a business disruption in the event of a crisis. They've created a patent-pending guaranteed employee housing program which secures and protects hotel rooms for critical personnel and their families if needed while saving companies significant expense. Continuity Housing has a 100% success record with their deployments, and each member of their team has at least 10 years of experience. For information on receiving a free 30-minute consultation about your deployment housing needs, visit continuityhousing.com or leave a comment in the survey that will pop up at the end of the webinar. At this time, given it's Veterans Day today, I'm going to call up our chapter president, Charles Jones, for a few words. Please welcome Charles.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here today, and I just wanted to take a moment just to really honor the veterans and that are out there. That this is a day. I come from a military family, and that I know a lot of other people do, and the service that is provided by our military members, past and present, is really just such a great gift that's given to the whole country. I just wanted to take a moment to thank all the veterans that are here today and all the veterans that are listening in today. And if you have a moment today and you meet a veteran, be sure to thank them for their service. Thank you.
Thanks, Charles. This and previous webinars are recorded and made available on the ACP website. Please feel free to share the link to the recordings with your peers and anyone you think might benefit from it. You'll receive a link to the recording after the webinar via email along with additional information on the topical content. Today's webinar is a live broadcast of the Connecticut Chapter's monthly program at Northeast Utilities headquarters in Berlin, Connecticut, just outside of Hartford. It's a very special program, and we're thrilled to make it available to such a large and diverse audience. For those of you out there, there's about 35 people here today, and they're quiet because they just had a big lunch. So now we're ready for the program. And at this time, I'd also like to thank our Connecticut Chapter Program Director, Debbie Sullivan, who arranged for these great speakers today. Thanks, Debbie. We have two related topics today. First, Cynthia Simeone and Steve Crimando will present on human factors in business continuity planning. Cynthia is an expert in business continuity planning, and Steve's a behavioral scientist, outlining key psychological and behavioral considerations across the 4 phases of emergency management: mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. Cynthia will introduce a business continuity planning challenge for each phase, and Steve will couple that with research and case studies and examples to help us as business continuity planners make accurate behavioral assumptions specific to that phase and the unique challenge. And then together they'll suggest how to best apply that knowledge through policies, planning, procedures, and exercises. Our second presentation, and before we get into the second presentation, we'll have Q&A, and we'll probably take a break because we're actually going to break the recordings into 2 because it's a long program. But our second presentation will be by Stephen Thal and Jeff Heisner on accommodating people with disabilities in business continuity planning and emergency response. Stephen and Jeff bring us this terrific content-rich presentation from the Connecticut Capital Region Emergency Planning Committee. Stephen has more than 40 years of professional and volunteer work providing training and public education on blindness and eye care. And Jeff Heisner is a seasoned business continuity and disaster recovery expert. And for our first presentation, please join me in welcoming Cynthia Simeone and Steve Crimando.
Thank you, Ed.
Thank you.
On behalf of Cynthia and myself, again, thanks to all our veterans in the group today, and thank you so much for joining us and the invitation to be here. I'll tell you a little bit about our presentation as we go, Ed. Discuss the idea that we'll be alternating between the kind of behavioral science concepts and their adaptation to a business continuity environment. And Cynthia and I have worked together for probably almost a decade now in different capacities doing just that. So we do think we'll be able to provide some useful examples, some good practical take-home actionable sort of applications for the information that we have. Please remember that the program today, I believe, is being archived and recorded. So you can go back to these slides. I know we're going to cover a fair amount of material in a relatively short amount of time. So all that material is there. And at the very end, of course, there's contact information for both of us if you'd like more about any one of the considerations or aspects that we share. My background, very quickly, is 25 years now, since 1989, working as a behavioral scientist, applying those concepts to homeland security and private security as well as business continuity. Today I work as a consultant and trainer for the Justice Department, through the FBI and Office of Victims of Crime, through the Department of Homeland Security, most often with FEMA, but also at the United Nations with their medical services and emergency preparedness teams. I'm a responder as an EMT. I have been a first responder to both World Trade Center attacks in '93 and 2001, 72 days on the pilot ground zero, except for 2 weeks when I was taken off that operation to run psychological services at the Anthrax Screening Center, just to kind of like lighten the mood for me. You have to do that sort of thing on occasion. Cynthia?
Hi, and I'm Cynthia Simeone. I'm a business continuity professional with certifications in project management, business continuity, and then the new certified healthcare professional continuity planner. I have experience mainly in financial services, healthcare, manufacturing, supporting organizations with operational effectiveness, but mostly focusing on business continuity, resilience. Currently I'm with Catholic Health Initiatives. That role spans emergency management, traditional business continuity, disaster recovery, and physical security. It's a pleasure being here. Thank you.
As we start to think about this idea of accurate behavioral assumptions, when we think about this, I want you to hold on to one idea as a kind of an anchor, which is the idea that practice does not make perfect. Perfect practice makes perfect. If we're not rehearsing something with a degree of accuracy exactly how we'd like that to unfold under crisis conditions, I can assure you that under the stress of a real disaster, people's behavior may be radically different than what you anticipated in your plan. We do not rise to the occasion. We fall to our training in crisis conditions. Therefore, as we look at plans, policies, procedures, and exercises, what we're going to suggest today, both Cynthia and I, is thinking about taking on board some of these concepts to guide those different functions, planning, procedures, exercises, and so forth, so they are aligned more accurately with what people are most likely to do in disasters and not simply what the plan suggests they do, because very often people don't read the plan and don't follow the plan. So how do we then start to make assumptions about what people will actually do? We're going to spend a little bit of time of talking about some of the research and some of the guidance around that, and then more specifically going into what people are more likely to do in different disaster and crisis situations. Lastly, we're going to give you some guidance in how we apply that. And as we move from section to section, we're going to take a quick break, and Cynthia and I are going to hopefully have a dialogue both between us and perhaps with you yourselves as how we apply some of that thinking as per the specific section to our role in planning and how we look at the benefit of those behavioral kind of concepts, those applications to your real world challenges. In doing so, we start with the idea, and you know, Ed, I'm going to ask, I think what's happening with this is because the red light's on is the batteries are going. So I'm going to swap off and give you a different controller very quickly. We'll give you the different receiver as well. Sorry for the disruption.
Let me see if I got some batteries here.
Here you go. So there's our first assumption about technology. Very good. Good. Forming accurate behavioral assumptions. I want you to think about three key starting foundational concepts. The first is that human behavior, the human response to disasters and crises is phase specific. What I mean by phase specific is, I think it's your experience as well as mine, that the way people react in hour one is different than day one, week one, month one, and year one. What that says to us in planning is we cannot make assumptions or generalizations that our approach is going to be appropriate across the entire timeline. We're going to continue to adjust our approach to the behavioral reaction to disasters in a phase-specific way. The second key consideration is that the human response to disasters and crises is hazard-specific. We do not react the same way to a fire, flood, or earthquake as we do to a shooting event, as we do to a disease outbreak, and so forth. So that's kind of a little bit of contradiction with the all hazards planning approach, which we apply a similar template or mindset across all different sorts of hazards. When we look at this from a behavioral science standpoint, what we know is we get very radically different behaviors in different sort of crisis events. And the recommendation, therefore, is we adjust the specific plans for different hazards based on hazard-specific behaviors. Lastly, the idea is that certain events, your challenge will primarily be the behavioral management of the crisis, not the physical impact of the event. Let me give you an example to make that more clear. Sarin nerve gas attack in March of 1995 in the Tokyo subway produced a 4-to-1 ratio of behavioral casualties to medical casualties. In plain language, saying that for every one person truly exposed to gas running to hospitals seeking EMS support with gas exposure symptoms, 4 times that number also showed up with gas exposure symptoms seeking assistance who had never been anywhere near this stuff. Now, you may consider that psychosomatic. More technically, we refer to that as psychogenic. But those individuals are not faking it. They're not being hypochondriacs. They truly have the signs and symptoms of gas exposure. Psychogenic suggests that they are stress-driven. They are psychologically caused. But you simply can't tell people, sir, ma'am, it's all in your head. You're fine. You were never near that stuff. Go home. And the worst, or perhaps the best case example of this, is in September of 1987 in Goiânia, Brazil, in which an accidental release of cesium-137 produced a ratio of 500-to-1 of behavioral casualties to medical casualties and completely overwhelmed that government's ability to manage the event. In that instance, the Brazilian government had to open the Olympic Soccer Stadium as a radiation screening site. In the first week, 112,000 people believing they were exposed to radiation had showed up for screening. And out of the first 60,000, in round numbers, 5,000 had the signs and symptoms of acute radiation sickness, and not a single one of them had been exposed. What does that do to our local medical emergency response capabilities? So there are some event types in which your primary challenge will be the behavioral management of the event and not necessarily the physical impact of the event. So this block of information, when we think about where we're coming from with this, is the importance of understanding that our impression, and what we know by studies in this area, is very often emergency management personnel, as well as leaders in our community, get most of our information about human behavior from movies and from the news, which are not necessarily accurate. If you have a flood in your community, you open up a shelter, and you have 300-400 people standing peacefully in line to get into the shelter, but you have 3 or 4 knuckleheads uptown kicking in the window and looting a store, where's your news team going? To the knuckleheads, aren't they? That's the thing that's interesting, but it's not representative of what people typically do. And movies are dramas. They sensationalize. They're not accurate representations about human behavior in the media. I think I actually need to be behind this where the radio signal will work. So we're going to have to do that throughout. So as we think about then the importance of understanding what people really will do, we understand that there's lots of myths and exaggerations about things like looting. On the bottom line here, the idea that emergency workers may abandon their posts. There are examples of all of these myths, but they're not representative. They're outliers. On occasion, in very rare and very extreme circumstances, we may see these behaviors, but this isn't the big picture. This isn't what people are most likely to do in disasters, and it's important for us to anchor our plans and policies in what is most likely, not just that outlier sort of behavior. When we don't make accurate behavioral assumptions, There's a high likelihood that our plans, our policies, our procedures may be ineffective, may be inappropriate, in some ways actually may be dangerous, both for the community and for those workers who are involved in emergency response. If you have not read it, this is going to be one of my, I guess, single best recommendations for you, the Redefining Readiness Study. A show of hands very quickly in this room at least. How many folks have read that study? Cynthia has, of course you have. September of 2004, the New York Academy of Medicine published a study known as Redefining Readiness. The principal investigator was Dr. Roz Lasker. Lasker and her associates, through random phone dialing, surveyed a significant portion of the U.S. population, asking people how they would behave in two emergencies. The first was an RDD, radiation, right? So a dirty bomb scenario. In this instance, people were asked, if there was an actual dirty bomb detonation in your community, you were instructed by emergency managers to shelter in place, get in, stay in, and tune in. Would you? And the answer for 1/4 of the population surveyed said no. They're leaving wherever they are, even if shelter is provided to them. They're going to try to get home to their partners, their plants, their spouses, their pets, whatever it is. They're not going to die here alone and let others die alone without them. 1/4 of the population being outdoors during an actual radiation emergency puts a lot of people in harm's way. Agreed? And it mucks up emergency operations. Fear-based, illogical sort of decision-making, but now it gets actually more pronounced because she only asked 2 questions. In the second question, she asked people how they would behave during a smallpox outbreak. Now, you know this, of course. Smallpox is largely eradicated, but if we were to have one smallpox case anywhere in the world today, tomorrow we're standing up vaccine operations here. Such a highly contagious, such a deadly disease, we believe none of us has a viable immunity to it today, even if you have that mark on our shoulders. Lasker asked people, if there was a smallpox outbreak, you were instructed by the government to go vaccinate. 2/5 of the population said they would refuse to go vaccinate. Why? Primarily based on fear of adverse reaction to the shot. Now listen to the math on this very quickly. Smallpox has a 1 case third fatality rate. 1 out of every 3 people exposed will die. The other 2/3 may have serious and permanent scarring and disfigurement from the disease. Your chances of dying from the shot, the vaccine, are roughly 1 in a million. But 2/5 of the U.S. population surveyed said they would take their chances with 1 in 3 of dying of the disease versus 1 in a million of dying of the shot. So we get fear-based, illogical, irrational decision-making in the face of different fear scenarios. And I want to talk to you about what elements in the scenarios trigger that and how we counteract that. So Cynthia and I are going to give some examples. And I would recommend very good material online today, still from the Redefining Readiness study. There's some videos, there's the study itself, and lots of good documentation. But from a business continuity standpoint, this is a recommended reading from my perspective, Redefining Readiness. I teach today 16 different courses. They all have a common theme, which is referred to as tactical psychology. It's the use of clinical, cognitive, and social psychological concepts for their operational value. So I'm not speaking to you at all today about post-traumatic stress disorder, about critical incident stress debriefing. I'm not speaking at all about the emotional response. Today's discussion is isolated to the behavioral response. In very concrete terms, what people do and don't do. And it starts with this, if you're not familiar, Lewin's equation. Dr. Kurt Lewin is thought to be the father of social psychology. Lewin had said, human behavior is a function of both the person and the environment. Now, we can probably not hope to know every person we're going to encounter in the emergency environment, whether they're employees or family members and such, but we can say with some degree of confidence what sort of environments will bring about what sort of human behavior, what sort of reactions, and that information, that's available to all of us, and it is very informative in terms of creating plans that will actually hold water because people will do what we want them and need them to do in a crisis. I mentioned this earlier, just to point out it is in the slides. Human behavior in a disaster is phase-specific, it's hazard-specific, and this last point, that idea of the behavioral footprint, is what I mentioned about the cesium event in Guyana or the Tokyo subway event, that we do get a very large behavioral response, especially in invisible threats, something we can't see, smell, hear, or taste, like a disease outbreak. We'll talk a little more about Ebola as we go through the material. As I said, Our responses could be ineffective, they could be dangerous, it could complicate the response, our organizational response. It could lead to more physical harm and certainly more mental health consequences post-crisis as well. So very, very good motives for doing this. And I gave you the example before about the behavioral footprint, the sarin example, and notice I did embed in the slides the actual journal studies and the research that corresponds to these stories, so you can learn more about them as you'd like. So Cynthia and I have worked together as colleagues. We've worked together as consultant and client in many different settings. And we wanted to start talking about just those very basic concepts, some applications of the business continuity, and we'll do this at the end of each of the 3 sections. So Cynthia, when you are very familiar with those key concepts, what are some of the applications in current or prior work where you've seen those key concepts come together?
So one of the things that I appreciate with Steve is that he provides a great deal of scientific knowledge. And what I try to do is apply that solid scientific knowledge to my planning. So specifically, how many of you have ever had the experience, well, that didn't go as I thought it was going to? Right? If you start thinking about some of these principles, you can get a little bit more accurate response. I'm not going to say you're going to get 100% accuracy in your responses of how things are going to end up. But one example is I was working with a financial services company, and we needed to plan for an upcoming hurricane. And we thought about actually evacuating all employees should this hurricane hit this location. And we put all of our plans together. We had the evacuation people. We had the helicopters, the airplanes. We back here in the States, we got the hotels. We got schooling. We thought we had everything planned. So hurricane is on its way, and the call came out for people to actually board those planes. And a small majority, not a lot, but many refused. Why do you think they refused? They had their property, their pets. We did not have a plan for their pets, and so they did not want to participate in the evacuation. It's human nature to want to protect your entire family unit, and that includes pets.
So that's human behavior. Agreed? We can anticipate that. What we do about that operation is, you may be familiar in many states, and I actually believe in Connecticut as well, there are programs such as SART, S-A-R-T, which is a state animal response team. It's part of a larger national movement called EARS, Emergency Animal Rescue Services, which are vets and veterinary assistants who come together in the second wave of a disaster to go retrieve and evacuate pets. One, for the humane value of those pets who may be stranded during a disaster, but secondly, because we prevent people from going back into disaster environments and putting themselves in harm's way. So we understand this one aspect. We've seen this where a behavioral factor, people's attachment to pets, will actually prevent an effective evacuation and maybe lure people back into a dangerous scenario. So the operational is, how do we start building plans around pet care, pet sheltering, pet transportation in those situations, because we know that can be a barrier. So one good example.
So one thing that I would recommend, I'm also a project management professional, and one of the things that we look at in project management are risks. And I highly recommend as business continuity professionals that you also try to do the what-if scenarios. Think about the risks, really take whatever the situation is completely outside of the box. Think of the worst possible case scenario that you can envision and then plan backward, because you can bet that the worst case scenario will eventually occur. As Steve mentioned, it's time specific, it's threat specific, and your responses to planning need to also be time and threat specific and target specific.
So your plan can be very tight. You and your team can have practiced it, maybe tabletopped it, but when we put it under the stress of a real situation, we start to see unique behaviors come up that often can be obstacles, either preventing the plan from moving forward or making a bad thing worse. So let's turn the corner then and start talking about some of those specific psychological factors that should form kind of the basis for your assumptions. And then in the last block, we're going to become more practical in the application of these. But Cynthia and I will kind of come together again in just a few moments in terms of where these behavioral factors or key concepts come into play. The first of these key concepts is the idea that we're talking more than just traumatic stress and PTSD, although those have to be part of your understanding and equation, that we're really talking more about these kind of invisible threats, things as the somatic behaviors I mentioned before that actually may drive increased health care seeking, which may lead to absenteeism in which people are refusing to come to work. And for your teams, we're going to speak in the last block of instruction very specifically about research and recommendations for how you get your team members in and get them to stay during a crisis response. Because we know there's a lot of challenges, person-role conflict and other challenges that we need to overcome. One of the concepts here that's embedded in this text is the idea of bookends. And what I mean by bookends is when an event, and typically natural disasters and conventional terrorism have these dynamics. Conventional terrorism is bombing, shooting, and kidnapping versus unconventional terrorism, which is things like chemical, biological, radiological sorts of threats. When an event has bookends, what we mean by that is it's very clear when it starts, when it stops, and if you're in or out. And obviously in a natural disaster, if you think about something like a tornado, it's so clear in that way, you could tell exactly where the path of this was. You know when it started, you know when it stopped, you know if you're in or out. When we see that sort of event, we have two foreseeable behavioral reactions. The first is we're likely to have traumatic stress reactions. This is not to say that people go on to develop diagnosable PTSD or acute stress disorders, but traumatic stress reactions at all levels are characterized by the same three features: arousal, avoidance, and re-experiencing. Arousal means people are wired, they're jumpy, they're hyper, they can't settle down. That's all the adrenaline that kind of drives our fight and flight response. People are wired. So that interrupts sleep and appetite and concentration and performance on the job. Avoidance is people don't want to be reminded of the bad thing that's happened. So they don't drive down that street anymore. They don't go back to the place where the negative event occurred because it's too uncomfortable. It's too unpleasant. It brings it all back. That's avoidance. And re-experiencing may be in dreams, nightmares, flashbacks, just intrusive thoughts that disrupt this individual from their work when the event has bookends. And that scenario, the reaction is typically very acute. It starts fairly quickly after the negative event. And it tends to subside over time, absent of a lot of reminders. But when we have an event that lacks bookends, we have a much different reaction, and that is much more somatic. It manifests itself as bodily aches and pains and signs and symptoms, things that, again, lead to absenteeism and things that also have a psychological contagion because it spreads, especially now in an age of social media, can spread through your organization, can spread through a community very quickly, and people start to develop these reactions that seem medical. But upon examination, there's no underlying illness or injury, but they can be highly disruptive, and we have seen them shut businesses down when we lack the bookends. So we'll talk about some other scenarios, again, around these ideas. But remember that for our discussion today, when we're speaking about emotional reactions, those are more in the mental health range. So those are anxiety, their fear, their stress. But behavioral implications are very much what people do and don't. So when we talk about potential adverse, although there are potential positive sorts of behaviors as well, potential adverse reactions are things like noncompliance with vaccines, which we just mentioned, but also noncompliance with quarantine and isolation, said the nurse in Maine. I'm not staying in. So even though health officials say the appropriate or the desired response is quarantine, we'll have people break quarantine. When there are travel restrictions imposed. You may remember this case a few years ago about the fellow who had antibiotic-resistant tuberculosis and got on a plane to fly to his honeymoon in Italy. So here again, we have a range of different potential adverse behaviors that can lead to more harm. And of course, a range of potential emotional reactions as well. Oh, pushed the wrong one there, sorry. Such as certainly acute fear, stress, grief, anxiety, all kinds of different reactions. And I spoke for just a moment about traumatic stress, that arousal, the avoidance, and re-experiencing, whether it's at the diagnostic level or otherwise. What is a great indicator of the potential of those behaviors is the presence of dread. So I want you to think about something like Ebola, or even something like an active shooter event, which unfortunately you know well too much here in Connecticut. I'm taking from Amanda Ripley. If you're not familiar with Ripley, I'd recommend one of her books to you. The book is called Unthinkable. Ripley is a Time magazine reporter, and the central thesis of her work, her whole career, is talking about human behavior in crises and emergencies. Not so much the mental health consequences, but again what people do and don't do. And Ripley has said one of the factors that guides response is the presence or absence of dread. And dread, she says, is a combination of different factors. Is the event perceived by people as being uncontrollable? Well, of course, many disasters are. Can't stop the water from rising, can't stop the bad guy from shooting. Is it unfamiliar? Well, that's where something like Ebola comes in. If you live in the central Congo area in Africa, you're very familiar with Ebola over the years. If you live in the Northeast here in the States, it's probably something brand new and very, very frightening. Unimaginable, a high degree of suffering, potentially a large-scale destruction. And is there an element of unfairness in the event? When those factors are present, dread tends to be a multiplier of psychological trauma, of psychological stress. So all events represent some threat to our status quo or equilibrium. They're uncomfortable. They put us out of our comfort zone. But when dread is present, it actually magnifies the psychological effects and creates a different sort of magnitude of the event. Now, these are one of those take-home sort of slides. These are kind of concepts that Cynthia and I embed into our daily work. And we're thinking, as Cynthia says, evaluate risk. Think about worst-case scenarios. We'll think about an event, and we'll say between ourselves, as we discuss this in planning, what type of behavioral reaction do we think we'll have? Type 1, 2, or 3. A type 1 behavioral reaction is the most common sort of reaction in your organization or your community. It is the altruistic response, neighbor helps neighbor. So let's picture this. We have a winter storm coming in. It takes down trees. It takes down lines. You feel very badly for a neighbor down the street who's had damage to their home. Chances are you want to bake him a casserole and bring it down the street, right? That's what we do. It's human nature. But let's say the problem down the street now at your neighbor's home is not damage from a storm, but someone's sick home with a highly contagious disease. You're probably going to forget all about the casserole, aren't you? Love to help you out, but now I can't because I have a realistic concern that me reaching out to you might get me sick, might bring it home to my family. Why is that important? Because the single greatest asset you have in a post-disaster environment is community cohesion. Whether the community is in your workplace or in your neighborhood, your town, your state, community cohesion and fear starts to erode that cohesion because now people can't reach out to each other. Think about this in pandemic planning. Think about this on Ebola. As we become frightened of each other, we distance, we can't reach out, and we might even have some degree of stigma against that person who we think is a risk. But in the worst case scenario, fear becomes so acute that it could potentially trigger a panic. And a panic is when people start to compete. So here's a good application of panic, very, very quickly. The weatherman says you're going to get 4 whopping inches of snow on Friday. What's it like at your grocery store? The line goes around the whole store. What are people buying? Milk, bread, eggs. We're all having French toast after the storm, right? I do this lecture some places. I say, what are people in the store for? I said, beer. We're going for beer. Bread, milk, and eggs. Perception of limited opportunity for critical supplies or limited availability of escape are the 2 drivers of panic. But please note in our slides, panic is actually unlikely in most disasters. Let me give you 2 very quick examples. 1, limited opportunity for escape. Bridge in Baghdad, August 2005. The huge religious pilgrimage is moving through town, and they kind of bottleneck up on this one bridge going through Baghdad. Someone on the bridge yells out they think they see wires hanging from someone's backpack, a suicide bomber on the bridge. In the stampede to get off the bridge, 965 people are killed. Guess what? No bomber. Disasters can create crowds, but crowds can create disasters. In the stampede to get off the bridge, based on perception of limited opportunity for escape, we have a mass casualty event, nearly 1,000 killed. Perception of limited availability of critical supplies, The single greatest cost for overtime for NYPD officers in Hurricane Sandy were officers watching the gasoline lines, where they had several instances of people actually pulling guns on each other if they thought that someone cut in line. So there we have the potential to bring out the very worst in human behavior, but it's based on the dynamics of the event. Is there perception of these different risks, going back to the ideas of type 1, type 2, and type 3 reactions. So those are central, again, to our thinking. What kind of reaction would we imagine in this scenario that we're modeling, we're planning for, we're creating a tabletop for? But we know what is more likely than irrational and illogical fighting and fleeing. What is more likely than overreacting is actually underreacting. Is people not taking your messages serious enough to plan, to prepare, to evacuate, to quarantine, whatever it is. So how do we get our message at the right level? How do we build our plans in a way that accommodate, again, what we think people will do in these scenarios? So I did mention the bookends concept. Just to point out quickly, it is in your slides if you were trying to capture or jot down notes about that. But I wanted to spend a moment more about what those atypical reactions look like when an event lacks bookends. I used the idea, or I mentioned the term before, of psychogenic. Psychogenic were those stress-induced sort of reactions. A good way to think about this is if you or if anyone in your home or family gets hives when they're stressed. They're not imagining they have hives, agreed? You could see them, they could see those raised red welts on their, on their skin. That is stress-induced, it's stress-driven. What you should expect in events that lack bookends, like a disease outbreak, like a chemical leak, like a bioterrorism scenario where you receive a white powder letter in your mailroom, something of that effect, is the potential for these reactions. MIPS and MUPS are the top of this list. MIPS, multiple idiopathic symptoms, MUPS, multiple unexplained physical symptoms, is the idea that people start generating physical symptoms. You could see them, they experience them. The rash, the fever, the cough, the nausea, those sort of things for which there's no underlying medical explanation. So people tend to somaticize and convert that stress into medical symptoms, which is very confusing to them, and it's very confusing to the system as we have people show up with these symptoms and there's no explanation. That is fed by the potential for what we call misattribution of normal arousal. In plain language means the person who runs up to us in the emergency and says, you have to get me to the hospital right away. I know I was exposed to the bad stuff. Well, how do you know? Because my heart's pounding. I'm pouring sweat. I can't catch my breath. And this is their normal stress response, which they are misreading and misattributing to whatever the bad thing is. So it's reinforcing for them and it's reinforcing for people around them that they truly are sick, even though there may be nothing to it. And then especially in an age of social media, we have the potential for mass sociogenic illness, which is sometimes referred to as epidemic hysteria, in which those dynamics can move quickly through a whole community, can shut down the school system, can shut down a business, when we have that social contagion and this starts to spread through that community. We have the potential for panic, things like a run on the store for meds, for masks, for hand sanitizer, for Tylenol if we have a potential disease outbreak. And at the very same time, we know from our research that we have greater mistrust of public officials. So as soon as the mayor or the governor gets on television and says, you have nothing to worry about, is about when most people start really worrying. So here we know that these dynamics complicate our response because people truly feel that they and others are sick and no one is listening, or that people are trying to minimize the event. Let's go back one. If you're not familiar, this is referred to as the Yerkes-Dodson curve. It simply discusses the effect of stress on performance. The idea is that some stress, known as, again, the good stress, we refer to as eustress, motivates us. It gets us in gear. It puts us into that kind of attentive mode where we're dealing, a peak performance. But there's also for each of us a different set point, a different tipping point, where when we pass that, that stress starts working against us. It starts overwhelming us. It starts interfering with concentration, with all other aspects of performance. So how do we make sure we keep people in that productive zone where they're not becoming just overwhelmed by the stress of a situation? They can remain productive in our response and our recovery to an emergency. Cynthia, thoughts about those comments or those ideas?
Right. So fear of the unknown is really consequential to organizations and organizational success. And the way that I have dealt with this in the past recently with the pandemic planning and currently with Ebola planning is that you need to have a golden source of information for your organization. There's a lot of information out there. There's the CDC, there's the World Health Organization, there's your governors, there's so many medical experts that are trying to tell the world what's going on with Ebola. In my organization, we have chosen to develop our own golden source of information, and that is what we are sharing with our healthcare providers. So that they understand that we are monitoring the situation, that we will provide them with detailed information as to what they should and should not do should there be a serious issue around Ebola in our country. Communication is key. If you don't have communication, you have fear. And if your employees are fearful for themselves or their families, they're not going to produce for you as an employer. So the other thing that I highly recommend is to make sure that you promote personal preparedness within your organizations, because if their family members are cared for, they will be more than likely to actually come to work and support your organization in an emergency.
So let's think as a group for a moment. If we go back to the idea of type 1, 2, and 3 reactions in the community may be your workplace, your employees. And going back to Cynthia's example of Ebola. If we have an Ebola case at the local airport and comes into our state, into our community, what type at an initial level, I know there's a great variability around this, but just at this basic level, what sort of reaction do we think that can potentially produce in the community, in the workplace? Type 1, 2, or 3, based on what we discussed. I'd say type 2. I'd say that it starts to create a fear, right, that there may be a contagion. And what we have then as a consequence is rather than people reaching out, which they normally do, is now I have to be cautious. But there may be some people who say, I'm not coming to work yet. We just had a worker return from West Africa. I've heard all these things. I'm not coming in. I'm going to work from home for the next few days until we get a handle on this. Why are you allowing her back into work? You could hear that as well. So we have all those dynamics which starts to drive us apart. But now if we blend content from the first block of instruction with the second, the idea of, again, how these concepts come together, if I have that person come back into the workplace, and I know that we have the potential for that erosion, phase-specific and time-specific, in a time-specific way, if we escalate this to where now we have 3 or 4 cases in the state of Ebola, do you see how that may shift it from a type 2 to a type 3 emergency? And now people are out getting supplies and buying the things they need because they're concerned there may be a larger outbreak. So it's more than just distancing from each other that people actually start going into, in the face of a life-threatening disease, kind of go into survival mode. Seeing as winter is coming, whether you like it or not, I'm going to recommend a great movie for you, and no, it's not Contagion. I'm going to recommend on a snowy Saturday afternoon, you go online and find the old versions, the old original versions of The Twilight Zone, and look specifically for one episode that's called The Shelter. Make a note of that. It is so spot on in terms of human behavior and the potential for panic when there's a high degree of threat and a limited availability of a critical resource. I believe it's season 1, but regardless, it's from the original shows. If you go to YouTube and simply look for The Shelter from The Twilight Zone, that is a great piece of educational information. So how do we now operationalize this? And this is where I think Cynthia and I could be, most helpful to you today. The question is, how do we then anticipate the behaviors associated with different crises? And obviously, we're doing a 1-hour semester today. Many of these concepts we can dig in much deeper. How do we apply these concepts of phase-specific reactions in a planning way? And we'll give you some examples of how we do that. There we go. Cynthia and I think, one of our first projects together was, again, for financial services organizations around pan-flu planning. And we said to the group, who were making some, I will say, flawed assumptions about behavior, that people's behavior was going to be relatively flat, pretty much the same across the whole outbreak or whole pandemic. You know from your work that pandemic flu happens in waves, doesn't it? And there are very specific behaviors associated with each wave. So one of the questions I asked Cynthia and her group at the financial services as we started that is, panic is likely to be very disruptive during this sort of scenario. Where do you think panic is most likely to be? Over the whole timeline, where do you believe panic will be most acute and most disruptive? And we talked that through, and you see it represented here in the yellow line. Okay? It's on the front side of the first wave. Now, using what you know about pandemic influenza, why? Why would it be there, sir? So it's brand new, right? It's novel. And that's the nature of a pandemic. It's a novel threat. It's a novel thing. Because it's novel, what else is there or not there? Okay, and they're not prepared in part because there's no vaccine yet, and we can't have a vaccine until we have the disease, right? So not only is it new in terms of our consciousness and awareness and the threat, we don't have any degree of preparedness for it. We don't have the right meds. Lack of information. Okay, so there's a lot of unknowns. Folks, what else? Think this through. In a pandemic, which wave is likely to have the most deaths? The very first wave, because we don't have vaccine, because none of us have immunity to it yet. People who lived through the first wave, maybe were exposed, were infected, who lived through it, they're immune now, aren't they? So in the second wave, we're likely to have less panic. It's not as brand new. We have vaccine. People are starting to prepare. Some people develop immunity. We have all these things in place. So if we're looking at one dynamic, the potential for panic was isolated primarily or more acutely on the front side of the first wave. So as organizations are thinking about plans, about messaging, about how we're going to respond, if we seek to anticipate human behavior, here's a classic example of how it is phase specific. Panic will not be widespread across the entire time frame of the pandemic. It's going to be most acute at one phase. So then we looked with the team at the Financial Service Center and say, what do we need to do to make it less novel, more familiar? What do we have to do to help people feel more prepared, even in the absence of a vaccine? Sir? I'd say the question was, is there somewhat of a new paradigm in Ebola that because there's distrust of the CDC or government sources because they were wrong in many instances in the beginning or there were missteps, that undermines confidence? My answer is going to be yes and no. Are those dynamics present in the Ebola situation? I'd say yes, and it undermines public confidence. Are they new? I would say no. If we think back to something like swine flu and President Ford, you will recall that there was a mandatory vaccination, and most people who died during the swine flu outbreak died from the vaccine and not from the disease. The disease never reached pandemic sorts of levels. So the dynamic of mistrust and missteps by government organizations here and abroad, that is not a new paradigm. But what is fueling this more, part of the new paradigm, is social media, is the way we communicate constantly in real time in the flow of information. If you think back to earlier generations, we got the news pretty much once a day. So governments and organizations had time to adjust messaging throughout the day, get it right once. But because this is happening in real time, the focus on missteps is so much quickly picked up and so much magnified, I believe, that it is a game changer. So the dynamic is not essentially new, but how the dynamic is communicated to the public is relatively new. So we take then this idea, and what I've done is just create for you a wireframe, which is to say to almost any hazard, and you can fill in the blank, we can look at, and it may be that there's more than 3 phases, what are the likely stages or phases of this crisis, of this disaster, and then what are the likely behavioral reactions that are per that phase? What do we need to do in concert with our communications department? What do we need to do with our teams, with our supervisors and managers that may reduce some of those disruptive behavioral reactions to comfort people to have them feel on top of that? And my last key point for today, and then Cynthia and I will talk a little bit about how we model and use that as well, is a very important piece of research for us that's called the EPPM. The EPPM is the Extended Parallel Process Model. It was developed by Dr. Kim Witt at the University of Michigan. And what Witt and researchers found, and they found this across a wide variety of hazards and a wide variety of different cultures. They did this worldwide. But it began with nurses during pan flu. And the basic question was, will they come to work and will they stay at work during a crisis? And as you'd imagine, for many people, the answer was no. I'm not coming in. I'm not going to expose myself and my family to this. I'm going to ride it out, even if it costs me my job. I'm not going to get myself or my family in trouble with this flu. What Witt found is when people are confronted with novel threat information, this is probably the most important thing that Cynthia and I could share with you today and how we use this. When people are confronted with new and threatening information, they run it through two cognitive filters very quickly. The first is about concern. And concern at two levels. One, how susceptible am I? Because if it's something you're telling me affects primarily children, well, that's not me, and maybe I don't have children at home, whatever my concern is. So what does it mean to me? Is it something that targets me and my family? Or I don't really need to pay much attention to that. And how big and bad is it? How severe is it? It's something that really should get my attention. The other two dynamics under confidence are, do I know what to do? And does my organization know what to do to manage this threat? In this way, we come up with a very quick sort of grid in which where we know you want people to be, to improve the likelihood that they come and stay and focus on the task during a crisis, is this sweet spot in this quadrant where both people have a high degree of concern. Let me go back one step. They've walked through that kind of mental process, and they've assessed, yes, this has to do with me, susceptibility. Yes, it is big and bad. If the answer is to no to either of those, it doesn't apply to me, it's not big and bad, they opt out. If it is big and bad and it does have to do with me, the next question is, do I know how to handle it, and does my organization know how to handle it? If the answer is no again, we run into this fear-driven response where we become counterproductive. But if the answer to those is both yes, concern is high and confidence is high, we get the best potential reaction, which is people, again, doing what we hope they will do during the crisis or the disaster. The sweet spot is that people both have a realistic concern about how scary the event is and what they should be doing about it. What managers and supervisors often do, though, which is counterproductive, is try to minimize fear. They try to control the fear level of this. Let's go to that slide for a moment. And sugarcoat it in some way that it's not as big as bad as you think. That is not necessarily helpful. What is most helpful is realistic appraisal, to put people in touch with the information, let them make their own decisions, because if we come across as minimizing the risk, that is not potentially helpful. And it diminishes trust in those leaders making the messages. Here's some of the quotes from people in the survey, things that also add to their effectiveness during a crisis. My response, personally, I can make a difference in how this disaster unfolds and how we respond. I can do what's expected of me. I have an important role. And as you'd imagine, the more important the person perceives their role to be, the more likely they are to opt in and do those things we need them to do during the crisis. So the lessons to managers is that a sense of threat is important. Let people, one, see that this is something frightening. Two is let them see in a transparent way what you're doing. Let people know that you're planning. Let people see that you're exercising. Sometimes we have an expression, let them see you flail. Let them see you struggle with it and even make the missteps. So to the gentleman's question about the new paradigm, conflicting information and missteps by government agencies and so forth, that undermines confidence to a degree. But in some way, it helps people understand the reality, because if someone came out right away and said, we know exactly how to handle Ebola, my question would be, how? How do you know that when we've never had something like this on our shores? That sounds a little bit overly optimistic to me. So we neither want to overplay it. We don't want to dramatize it and sensationalize it. That's not productive. But you also don't want to sugarcoat it in a way that works against you in responding to the situation. So Cynthia, if we think about those messages, I wanted you to think about not only how we look at forming content, which is getting it to the right quadrant, but I want you to share with the group what you and I use is that 3T model, and a little bit of how we would use the content and blend it with 3 T's for delivery.
Right. So Steve and I have worked on several cases that really were behaviorally driven. They were workplace violence threats to individuals within certain organizations. And in order to assess the risk, there's a model that's very similar to what Steve showed a couple slides back. You need to look at the timing of what's happening, if we're at the beginning of the timing of the perceived threat or have things escalated and are getting more specific, so time specific. If the threats themselves are very specific, that will lead to a higher level of risk rating. And then timing, threat, and
target.
The target. If the threat has been specified to a particular person, to a specific location, if any of those have escalated in more concise information, that would mean that the threat is more valid, and therefore you really need to ramp up your planning around that threat.
Now we can also take that same concept of the 3 T's, target, timing, and type, to how you form communications during threatening times. So if we think about the first scenario, and let's go back to the workplace violence case very quickly, we have target audiences. In this instance, who did we want to communicate with about not just the threat, but the organization's response to the threat? Who needed to know what we were doing with security and guards and armed guards and everything else? Who were our target audiences in that situation?
Well, at the very beginning, it was just the people that were directly involved, because we didn't want to publicize that we had a threat. But we did want the people who were targeted to know that we understood that there was a threat, that we were looking into it, that we were making mitigation plans for them personally, both home and office situations.
But then as we hardened our security and we actually brought in armed guards for the next several days, it became a new target, a new audience who also need to hear about that, which was
then the population.
The whole workforce, who says, why are we all of a sudden having armed guards? So we think first, target, who's going to receive the message? The next question is, when are they going to receive it, which is timing, and that's spaced as well, because day one, the person threatened, they need to know right away.
Exactly.
But it wasn't until days later that the rest of the workforce needed to know that we have armed guards in the lobby because of this reason now. And the last of the 3 T's is type, which is what is the best way to communicate. And we blended it in this instance. Some people like to directly threaten an individual. They need to hear it face-to-face. Whereas the workforce, when we informed them about how we were stepping up to armed security, those were emails and other communications.
They were emails, and we used our emergency notification tool. And you can't please everybody, right? Some people felt that we didn't communicate enough. Others felt that, the threat wasn't real, so why were we bothering communicating? So you never can please everyone, but our sense is it's our responsibility, if we believe that a threat is viable, that it's our responsibility to communicate that out to the broader audience. And if we don't do that, that could set us up for potential litigation issues.
And just a very adverse reaction from the workforce, who feels that they're out of the loop, that there's obviously something going on. We have armed guards today. Why is no one talking to us about this? So then we take these two concepts, and closing out and then moving hopefully into a few questions and some discussion, we maybe take an idea like those 4 quadrants we looked at in the extended parallel process model. That will help us form the content. How do we structure a message that both informs people of the risk, and in this instance was, we had a viable threat against one of our employees of real violence. We wanted to be realistic. We also didn't want to scare the heck out of everybody. It wasn't necessary. And then we apply over that the 3T models, target, timing, and type. Who do we inform? Target. When do we inform? Timing. Type is how do we broadcast? What's the method of sharing the information? And that's where we get a good result. And I think we probably applied that over a 2 to 3 week span of managing this risk. and had to continually to adjust the message as we learned more about the threat, as we increase guard services, as we decrease guard services, and so forth. So there's one example about how we looked at a specific threat, both along the dynamics of its phase-specific nature and the type of hazard that it was.
Right. So something very simple, well, not that a threat is simple, but if you can imagine if we wouldn't have communicated and people saw armed guards, if I was uninformed and I didn't know what was going on, I would not have come to work. And so you need to do what's best for the organization while keeping the actual target.
And what we hear from that, exactly to your point, is people want to make their own decisions. I want to know realistically what's going on. You don't have to increase or decrease the level of fear. Give it to me straight. But I also want to know what I should do and what the company's doing to manage this risk. This is where we get our best result. That's our story, and we're sticking to it. We're going to ask for questions, comments, discussion. We have a few moments budgeted for that sort of thing. Debbie?
So I have a question. In my experience, a lot of organizations do kind of focus on the risk and effects within an organization as opposed to the community. And the community that happens around has a huge impact. How can you build realistically some of these, you know, we said one person could actually build 4 people who think they're ill.
Mm-hmm.
Are there numbers of statistics and you ever apply that to exercise to go, okay, we've got a group of continuity responders, but we have to actually put 30% of those out?
Yeah, we actually do.
Repeat the question.
I'm sorry. Repeat the question. Yes, the question from Debbie was, do we use some of these concepts to develop numbers for modeling behavior that can be useful in planning and exercising? And what I suggest is when you have an invisible threat, on the lowest end, we'll use that kind of 4-to-1 ratio. And on the high end, we can use up to a 10-to-1 ratio, depending on the nature of scenario. So let me give an example. We had a train car derail in southern New Jersey, CSX car carrying some sort of chlorine gas, and it blew through the neighborhood. Well, guess what? That community, that's not different than your workforce, is it? Those are the people who come to work each day. They live in those communities. But they had to evacuate their homes and stay out of their homes for nearly a month as that would be contaminated. So what's the effect on the workforce? The event happened in the community, but it trickles right down. Well, using that model, we knew that the invisible threat was going to yield a high number of these behavioral casualties, the walking well or worried well, we call them. And guess what? You had a lot of folks who were calling out sick with gas exposure-related symptoms who had never been exposed. Big numbers, when we had, for example, Top Off 3. Top Off 3, if you remember the exercise, was a mock plague attack which affected New Jersey, Connecticut, Canada, and the UK simultaneously for a week and resulted in 11,000 plague-resulted deaths. It's an invisible disease. It was being used in a terrorist scenario, but we applied that sort of mathematical model that would talk about surge to the hospitals. How overwhelmed would they be with people with these behavioral reactions? So the answer to the question in the shortest form is yes, we do and we can, and different organizations you have available. If you're not familiar, Connecticut has a very, very good disaster behavioral health contingent. It's based out of your state government and your Department of Human Services, who are people equally trained and expert in some of these ideas. Your guy in Connecticut is Jim Simonowski. So you do have pockets of this information. If you're building a plan or an exercise, you can bounce it off someone and say, Jim, build an exercise around this theoretical risk. What do you think the mental health or behavioral consequences will be? I want to make sure we get this right. And in each of your states, for those people who are listening remotely, you have someone in your state government who is what's referred to as the mental health authority. It's usually a government organization, Department of Health or Human Services, that can be an asset to you in planning. Yes, please.
With respect to responding to emergencies and ideally being in the quadrant of your personnel having the concern and the confidence being addressed, people have been identified as critical, essential employees. They get it. They understand the importance of their role and their responsibilities at time of an event. Do you have any additional insight or studies that you can share with us on actuals? So during an actual event, what is the likelihood that a staff member is going to really put all their personal situations and feelings aside and remain loyal
Well,
to helping the business recover.
I'll give you 2 examples, and Cynthia, if you could add to that discussion. One, as I mentioned, Dr. Witt's work, and I'd recommend looking at that sort of material. But specifically, a number of articles were published out of Hopkins looking at nursing personnel and others in different emergencies. And the numbers about who are likely to report. And the questions are 2. Who's going to come in and who's going to stay in? But beyond that, if you're not familiar, the idea of critical employee management, a lot of that came from a model developed in the Gulf region called CEEP, C-E-E-P, Critical Employee Emergency Preparedness. And this was pioneered right before and during Katrina by different organizations in the Gulf region. How do we identify and prepare those critical employees differently with the likelihood of meeting your target, getting them in and getting to stay? And there's some outcome data from the effectiveness of that. So you can find that online very easily as well under that acronym of CEEP and the Gulf States region effort. Those are probably, at least in my awareness, the only 2 that we're going to give you some sense of empirical base of what they found in their work. Cynthia, any ideas from you?
I was just going to also quote Katrina, articles and documents from Katrina, especially in the medical field. I believe that the majority of the medical field stayed and supported the hospitals that had been impacted. 5 Days at Memorial actually is an excellent book that highlights not only individual hospital preparedness, but having a broader organizational responsibility to the local entities, and that's something that we work on very closely in my organization. As we all know, emergencies happen at a local, in a local space. But if you have the means and the wherewithal to provide regional or national resources in an escalation model of response, that you'll have a better outcome.
Sorry. Do you feel the behavior might be different based on type of role, someone like emergency management, healthcare versus corporate?
Yes, there's actually, there's findings about that, and whether they're volunteer or professional, there tend to be some differences, but they're not exclusive. There's a lot of overlap between them, and you know what? A lot of people wear 2 hats. You find a lot of people who are in corporate community kind of work who go home and they join their CERT team. So there's kind of a very blurry line between that. The mindset, the temperament, and kind of the personality of people in those roles seems to be very, very similar across those lines. And so there's not a huge gap in terms of what we've seen anecdotally or in case study about that. It's actually fairly similar. The bigger challenge to finish that is the person who feels pulled, where are my loyalties to the company or my community because I'm a member of the CERT team and the corporate team. How do I kind of walk that line when we have a real community-based disaster? So that's a slightly different take on the challenge that you raised. Thank you, everybody. We appreciate your questions.
Thank you guys very much. And we always present to our presenters a little gift, and we don't go for the standard thing. Ed buys these, so we have a wall plaque for each of you.
Oh, thank you.
That is the 3
There's only
Stooges
2 of
disaster
us,
plaque. So.
Thank you so much. We appreciate that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's very sweet.
That's cute.
Yeah.